Kepler station hung in the void like a metallic chrysanthemum, its 17 arms bristling with the kind of technology that made lesser civilizations weep with envy. The Interstellar Military Academy had been constructed here, not for its strategic value, though being positioned at the intersection of 3 major trade routes certainly didn't hurt, but because the architects had wanted to create something that screamed, "We are very serious about producing competent officers," while simultaneously whispering, "And we have enough credits to build whatever ridiculous monument we please." The station's central hub housed the administrative offices, where bureaucrats from 47 different species spent their days creating forms that somehow managed to be incomprehensible in every known language. The outer arms contained everything from weapons ranges that could accommodate the Zephyrin preference for plasma-based combat to meditation chambers for the Serenity Collective's warrior monks, who insisted that true martial prowess could only be achieved through 12 hours of daily contemplation about the philosophical implications of violence. Today, however, the focus was on Training Sector 7, where the Academy's latest batch of cadets were about to participate in what the curriculum optimistically called Advanced Combat Simulation Protocol 447B. The name alone should have been a warning. Any military exercise that required both a number and a letter to distinguish it from its predecessors was generally the kind of thing that ended with someone filling out incident reports in triplicate. The cadets assembled in the briefing room represented a cross-section of galactic military might, which was to say they looked like someone had raided a xenobiology textbook and armed the results. There were the Krylites, whose idea of subtle reconnaissance involved stomping through enemy territory, while their natural armor plating deflected small arms fire. The Vexari delegation floated near the ceiling, their translucent forms flickering with bioluminescent patterns that supposedly conveyed tactical information, but mostly looked like someone had taught jellyfish to curse in Morse code. Near the center of the group stood the hegemony representatives, their perfectly symmetrical features arranged in expressions of polite superiority. They had volunteered for this training exercise with the enthusiasm of individuals who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of superior technology and condescending attitudes. Their equipment gleamed with the kind of finish that suggested it had been designed more for impressing procurement committees than surviving actual combat. And then there was the human. The human cadet stood among this collection of galactic military excellence like a slightly rumpled afterthought. Where the others had arrived with entourages of advisors, medical personnel, and enough support equipment to establish a small colony, the human had showed up with a duffel bag and what appeared to be a thermos of coffee that had seen better decades. The contrast was striking enough that several of the more observant cadets had begun to wonder if the human was actually a member of the Academy's janitorial staff who had wandered into the wrong briefing. This assumption was not entirely unreasonable. Humans, according to the Academy's comprehensive xenobiology database, were fragile creatures who required constant environmental regulation, regular feeding schedules, and protection from approximately 90% of the galaxy's naturally occurring phenomena. They were so delicate that most species classified them somewhere between decorative plant and exotic pet on the galactic hardiness scale. The fact that they had somehow managed to achieve spaceflight was generally attributed to dumb luck and an inexplicable talent for building things that exploded at convenient moments. The briefing began with the sort of methodical precision that military institutions cherished. Commander Vex Thyke, a hegemony officer whose facial tentacles had been arranged in what his species considered an expression of professional competence, began explaining the exercise parameters with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for reading equipment manuals aloud. "Today's simulation will test your ability to operate as a cohesive unit under extreme stress conditions," he announced, his translator rendering his words in the clipped, efficient tones that suggested he had practiced this speech in front of a mirror. "You will be inserted into a hostile environment and tasked with securing a strategic objective while under enemy fire. The simulation has been calibrated to provide a challenging but manageable experience for all participants." The phrase "challenging but manageable" was the kind of linguistic construction that should have triggered every survival instinct in the room. It was the military equivalent of "this won't hurt a bit," or "we're from the government and we're here to help." The fact that none of the cadets seemed to recognize this as a warning sign was a testament to either their inexperience or their touching faith in institutional competence. The commander continued his briefing, outlining the various safety protocols that had been implemented to ensure that this exercise would conclude with all participants in the same number of pieces they had started with. There were emergency medical teams standing by, automated systems that would extract any cadet whose vital signs approached concerning levels, and enough redundant safety measures to make a paranoid engineer weep with joy. The simulation environment has been tested extensively, Commander Vexthak assured them, his tentacles now arranged in what was probably meant to be a reassuring configuration. All equipment has been certified safe for use by cadets of all species classifications. The scenario has been designed to be educational rather than hazardous. The human cadet, who had been quietly sipping coffee throughout this presentation, made a small sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the kind of noise someone makes when they're trying not to laugh at something they probably shouldn't find amusing. Several of the other cadets glanced in the human's direction, but the expression on that unremarkable face revealed nothing more threatening than mild attention. As the briefing concluded and the cadets began moving toward the simulation chamber, the narrator of this particular story might have noted the irony of spending so much time discussing safety protocols for an exercise that was about to demonstrate the fundamental inadequacy of such preparations. But that would have been premature. After all, what could possibly go wrong with a challenging but manageable military training exercise conducted by competent professionals using thoroughly tested equipment? The simulation chamber doors hissed open with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested everything was operating exactly as intended. The cadets filed through, their various forms of protective equipment glinting under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The human brought up the rear, still carrying that thermos and wearing the expression of someone who was looking forward to an interesting afternoon. The doors sealed shut with a satisfying thunk that echoed through the observation deck, where Academy officials settled in to watch their latest batch of cadets prove their worthiness for military service. The simulation would begin in 30 seconds, providing just enough time for final equipment checks and last-minute doubts about the wisdom of this entire endeavor. 29 seconds, 28, 37, 26, 25. The simulation chamber materialized around the cadets with the kind of seamless technological wizardry that made lesser civilizations suspect the involvement of either advanced physics or outright magic. One moment they were standing in a sterile metal box, and the next they found themselves in what appeared to be the ruins of an industrial complex on some forsaken world where the architecture had been designed by someone with a serious grudge against right angles. The environmental controls kicked in with a subtle hum, adjusting atmospheric pressure, gravity, and ambient temperature to levels that the computer's vast database assured everyone would be perfectly comfortable for all species present. This was the kind of multi-verbal optimization problem that had kept entire teams of engineers employed for decades, and they had solved it with the sort of mathematical elegance that would have made their professors weep with pride. Unfortunately, mathematical elegance and real-world functionality were not always synonymous. The Kralites immediately began deploying their standard reconnaissance protocol, which involved advancing in formation while their natural armor deflected what the simulation presented as enemy small arms fire. The energy beams that struck their carapaces produced satisfying sparks and dramatic sound effects, but the Kralites themselves seemed about as concerned as someone might be about a light drizzle. Their species had evolved on a world where the local wildlife considered plasma discharge a form of polite conversation. The Vexari had taken to the artificial sky, their bioluminescent forms pulsing with tactical communications as they conducted aerial surveillance. From their elevated position they could observe the entire battlefield and relay information to their ground-based allies, with the kind of real-time coordination that made military strategists slightly envious and enemies significantly dead. The hegemony cadets had established a command position behind what appeared to be the ruins of some kind of manufacturing facility. Their equipment displays flickered with data streams that tracked every aspect of the engagement, from ammunition expenditure to atmospheric composition. They were the kind of military professionals who believed that any problem could be solved through the application of sufficient information and superior firepower. The human had found a piece of rubble that was approximately the right height to serve as a chair, and was using it to take what appeared to be a coffee break. This casual approach to what the other cadets were treating as a serious military exercise might have been amusing under different circumstances. However, the simulation's programming had been designed to escalate in difficulty as the participants demonstrated their competence. The computer's adaptive algorithms were currently analyzing the cadets' performance and concluding that they were handling the initial challenge parameters with disappointing ease. The response was predictable. If the current scenario was insufficiently challenging, then obviously the solution was to increase the challenge level until the participants were operating at the edge of their capabilities. This was sound pedagogical theory, implemented through the kind of automated systems that had never met a problem they couldn't solve by making it bigger. The first sign that something had gone wrong with this approach was when the simulated enemy forces began deploying weapons that were significantly more sophisticated than anything in the original scenario parameters. The energy signatures from their weapons jumped from training exercise to war crime in approximately 3 seconds, which was impressive even by the standards of military equipment malfunction. The second sign was when the environmental controls decided that the current atmospheric conditions were insufficient for a proper challenge and began introducing what the system's database cheerfully classified as mild atmospheric hazards. The fact that these hazards included airborne toxins that could dissolve most known armor plating was apparently considered a feature rather than a bug. The third sign was when the gravity generators, which had been providing a comfortable standard G environment, suddenly decided to demonstrate their full range of capabilities by cycling through gravitational conditions that ranged from slightly inconvenient to physically impossible, according to most theories of physics. The Kralites, who had been shrugging off simulated weapons fire with casual disdain, suddenly found themselves facing energy beams that could actually penetrate their natural armor. The satisfying sparks became considerably less satisfying when they were accompanied by actual tissue damage and the kind of pain that their nervous systems had evolved to interpret as immediate medical attention required. The first Kralite to fall did so with the kind of dramatic finality that suggested this was no longer a training exercise. The energy beam that struck him had been calibrated for what the computer assumed was an appropriate challenge level for someone of his species' documented durability. The computer's assumptions were based on comprehensive biological data, extensive testing protocols, and the kind of rigorous scientific methodology that had never actually been field tested under these specific conditions. The Kralite hit the ground with a sound like a sack of rocks being dropped from a significant height. His natural armor, which had been advertised as capable of withstanding direct hits from military-grade weapons, had developed several holes that were definitely not part of the original design specifications. The Vexari fared even worse when the atmospheric toxins reached their altitude. Their translucent forms, which had been pulsing with confident bioluminescence, began flickering in patterns that their species typically associated with extreme distress. The toxins, which had been calibrated as mild irritants for most species, turned out to have an unfortunate interaction with Vexari biochemistry that resulted in what medical personnel would later describe as rapid-onset systemic failure. 3 Vexari dropped from the artificial sky like deflated balloons, their bioluminescent displays now showing the kind of erratic patterns that suggested their nervous systems were having serious disagreements with their sensory apparatus. They struck the ground with wet sounds that were considerably less dramatic than the Kralites' impact, but significantly more disturbing. The hegemony cadets, who had been so confident in their superior technology and tactical superiority, discovered that their equipment had not been designed to function under the current gravitational conditions. Their displays flickered and died as the gravity fluctuations played havoc with their sophisticated electronics. Without their technological advantages, they found themselves facing simulated enemies with nothing but their natural capabilities. This would have been manageable if their natural capabilities had extended beyond looking professionally competent and operating complex machinery. Unfortunately, the hegemony's approach to military service relied heavily on technological superiority rather than individual resilience. When their equipment failed, they were left with approximately the same combat effectiveness as a group of particularly well-dressed accountants. The gravity fluctuations hit them next, cycling through forces that ranged from barely noticeable to everything in the room is now moving in directions that shouldn't exist. The hegemony cadets, who had never experienced anything more physically demanding than a mild headache, found themselves subjected to gravitational stresses that would have challenged a professional stunt performer. The first hegemony cadet to succumb did so when the gravity briefly spiked to approximately 4 times standard, which was sufficient to turn his perfectly symmetrical features into something that resembled abstract art. The second and third followed shortly after, when the gravity reversed entirely, launching them into the artificial sky before slamming them back down with the kind of force that suggested the simulation's safety protocols had experienced a catastrophic failure. By this point, the exercise had progressed from challenging but manageable to criminally negligent homicide, and the automated systems were still cheerfully escalating the difficulty level in response to what they interpreted as insufficient challenge parameters. The computer's programming had been designed by individuals who believed that any training exercise worth conducting should push participants to their absolute limits. Unfortunately, those limits turned out to be significantly lower than the programmers had anticipated. The observation deck had erupted into the kind of controlled chaos that military institutions specialized in producing during emergency situations. Officers were shouting orders that contradicted each other with impressive efficiency, while technicians frantically attempted to override systems that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of interference. Commander Vexthak's facial tentacles had arranged themselves into what was unmistakably an expression of professional panic. His carefully prepared briefing had not included procedures for dealing with a training exercise that had apparently achieved sentience and decided to commit genocide against the student body. "Emergency shutdown protocols," he bellowed, his translator struggling to keep up with the rapid-fire commands. "Medical teams to the simulation chamber. Override all safety parameters." The medical teams were already mobilizing, with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time the Academy's training exercises had exceeded their design specifications. Emergency medical equipment was being deployed, trauma specialists were being summoned, and someone was undoubtedly already preparing the paperwork that would be required to explain this incident to the various diplomatic representatives of the wounded cadets' homeworlds. Inside the simulation chamber, the carnage continued, with the relentless efficiency of a well-designed military exercise that had completely forgotten its original purpose. The surviving cadets were scattered across the artificial battlefield, most of them in various states of injury that ranged from requiring immediate medical attention to requiring immediate medical attention and possibly a priest, and through it all, the human cadet sat on that piece of rubble, still holding the thermos, watching the chaos unfold with the kind of mild interest that someone might display while observing an unusually dramatic weather phenomenon. The energy beam that struck the human should have been immediately fatal. The atmospheric toxins should have resulted in rapid systemic shutdown. The gravitational forces should have turned human anatomy into something resembling an abstract sculpture. Instead, the human took another sip of coffee and made a small sound that might have been disappointment about the beverage's temperature. The emergency shutdown finally engaged, and the simulation environment began dissolving around the cadets with the same seamless efficiency that had created it. The artificial battlefield faded away, leaving behind the sterile metal walls of the chamber and the kind of sudden silence that follows catastrophic system failures. Medical teams poured through the doors with equipment that looked like it had been designed to revive the recently deceased, which was probably appropriate given the circumstances. The wounded cadets were quickly surrounded by specialists whose expressions suggested they were already calculating the likelihood of successful treatment versus the probability of requiring closed-casket funerals. The human stood up, brushed some dust off the academy uniform and walked toward the exit with the casual stride of someone who had just completed a mildly interesting training exercise, rather than survived what appeared to be a systematic attempt at interspecies genocide. The medical bay of Kepler station had been designed to handle injuries that defied both common sense and several fundamental laws of physics. Treatment pods for 47 different species, diagnostic equipment that could identify undiscovered medical conditions, and enough emergency surgical capabilities to reassemble cadets distributed across multiple dimensions. Today, all of these capabilities were being tested. The Kralite in Treatment Pod 7 had experienced what medical professionals termed significant structural damage. His supposedly impervious natural armor now featured holes that went considerably deeper than the manufacturer's warranty anticipated. Dr. Kelvan examined the readouts with grim professionalism. The Crowlite would recover eventually, but the process would involve weeks of intensive treatment and enough medical resources to fund a small research hospital. Severe plasma burns, structural damage to the primary carapace, systemic shock from energy discharge, he muttered to his assistant. We'll need to synthesize replacement armor plating. The 3 Vexari were suspended in specialized treatment chambers, their translucent forms struggling to process atmospheric toxins that had been classified as mild irritants. Their bioluminescent displays showed what appeared to be the equivalent of screaming. The hegemony cadets occupied treatment pods 12 through 15. The gravitational forces had rendered their perfectly symmetrical features considerably less perfect, with vital signs fluctuating between stable and preparing final messages. Through this medical chaos, one figure moved with casual indifference that suggested either complete ignorance of the situation's gravity or an understanding that transcended normal emotional responses. The human cadet had been escorted to the medical bay for routine evaluation. The examination had been scheduled as a bureaucratic checkbox that military institutions loved. Dr. Kelvan approached with weary resignation. At least this would be straightforward. Humans were fragile creatures whose medical requirements were well documented. Let's get you checked out, he said, gesturing toward an examination table. Standard procedure. Shouldn't take long. The human settled onto the table with relaxed compliance. Medical scanners began their work, running diagnostic protocols refined over decades. The first scan completed, with a soft chime indicating normal results. Dr. Kelvan glanced at the display, expecting minor stress indicators that humans typically exhibited after non-standard conditions. Instead, the display showed readings that made him wonder if the equipment was malfunctioning. Run it again, he instructed, his voice taking on the tone of someone suspecting their day was about to become more complicated. The second scan produced identical results. The third, conducted with different equipment, confirmed the impossibility. According to every diagnostic system, the human showed no signs of injury whatsoever. This was medical impossibility. The energy beam should have resulted in catastrophic tissue damage. The atmospheric toxins should have triggered respiratory failure. The gravitational forces should have turned human anatomy into abstract art. Instead, the human's vitals showed steady patterns, suggesting someone who had spent the afternoon reading, rather than surviving mythological training exercise carnage. This doesn't make sense, Dr. Kelvan muttered, running increasingly sophisticated diagnostics with desperate intensity. These readings indicate you weren't exposed to any harmful conditions. The human looked mildly interested. Is that unusual? Unusual? Dr. Kelvan's voice cracked. You were exposed to energy weapons that hospitalized a Crelite. You breathed toxins that nearly killed 3 Vexari. You experienced gravitational forces that turned 4 hegemony cadets into abstract art. According to these scans, none of that happened. Well, the human said thoughtfully. It happened. I was there. I saw the whole thing. Dr. Kelvan stared at diagnostic displays that continued insisting the human had experienced no trauma. He ran additional tests, including some that hadn't been necessary since early interstellar medicine days. Every test produced the same impossible result. How do you feel? He asked finally, approaching the limits of his professional expertise. The human considered this with thoughtful attention. Fine, I guess. A little tired. The coffee in that thermos went cold, which was disappointing. The medical assistant suggested protective equipment they had missed. Dr. Kelvan examined the standard academy uniform consisting of fabric designed to be comfortable, durable, and approximately as protective as decorative tissue paper. No protective technology, no energy shielding devices, no environmental filters, no protective equipment, he announced. Standard uniform, no modifications, no additional gear, except for that thermos. Then how? The assistant began. I have no idea, Dr. Kelvan admitted, his professional demeanor cracking. According to everything we know about human physiology, this person should be dead, multiple times over. Instead, they're complaining about cold coffee. Word of the human's impossible survival spread through the medical bay with rapid efficiency. Medical personnel found excuses to walk past, hoping to glimpse the individual who had achieved the medical equivalent of dividing by zero. The human began looking around with polite interest, trying to be a good patient despite finding the situation slightly tedious. Moans and electronic beeping from other treatment areas provided constant reminders of what should have happened. "Would it be possible to get some fresh coffee?" the human asked eventually. "I mean, if it's not too much trouble. This is taking longer than expected." Dr. Kelvan stared with the expression of someone whose understanding of medicine had been subjected to forces exceeding its design specifications. Somewhere in the bay, a Kralite warrior evolved to withstand plasma weapons was undergoing emergency surgery. 3 Vexari were fighting for their lives against poisoning. 4 hegemony officers were being kept alive by machines performing functions their bodies could no longer manage. And the human wanted coffee. "Hold, see what I can do," Dr. Kelvan said weakly, as he walked away to arrange for probably the most expensive cup of coffee in the medical bay's history. He wondered if the Academy's xenobiology database needed significant updates regarding human physiology. Either that, or he needed to reconsider his career choices. Behind him, the human settled back and began humming quietly, a sound somehow more disturbing than all the medical alarms combined. The emergency session of the Academy High Command convened 3 hours after the medical bay had finished processing casualties. Commander Vexthak sat at the head of the table, his facial tentacles arranged in professional panic. The training exercise supposed to demonstrate excellence had instead demonstrated the Academy's commitment to creating diplomatic incidents. "Gentlemen," he began, "we have a problem." The understatement of the millennium hung in the air like a particularly awkward silence. Dr. Kelvan stood before assembled officials with the expression of someone whose understanding of biology had been thoroughly violated. "The casualties are stable," he reported, though "stable" was doing considerable work. "The Krolites will recover, though they're requesting hazard pay. The Vexari refuse to participate in activities involving breathing. The hegemony delegation is threatening to withdraw entirely." "And the human?" Commander Vexthak asked, though his tentacles suggested he suspected the answer would be problematic. The human asked for coffee and library directions, apparently wanted to catch up on reading while we sorted this out. The silence that followed typically preceded either breakthrough discoveries or complete institutional breakdown. "According to our analysis," Dr. Kelvan continued, consulting a tablet containing controversial medical data, "human physiology appears significantly more robust than documented. Energy weapons that penetrated Kralite armor were absorbed by human tissue with no damage. Atmospheric toxins that nearly killed the Vexari were processed as mild irritants. Gravitational forces that crushed the hegemony cadets were apparently within normal human tolerance." The implications spread through the Academy like institutional terror. If humans were more durable than species treating them as exotic pets, the entire galactic military hierarchy needed reconsideration. "What does this mean for our training programs?" asked the tactical instructor. "It means," Commander Vexthaf said slowly, "we may need to revise our understanding of human capabilities." Significantly, the human cadet had been located in the library, reading a tactical manual while drinking expensive coffee. When approached by officials seeking understanding, they offered observations both helpful and disturbing. "The simulation was interesting," they said casually, "though I'm not sure why everyone else seemed to have such a hard time. The gravity changes were fun, like a carnival ride. The energy beams were warm. The toxic atmosphere smelled like mint. The Academy's entire approach to human integration required fundamental revision. Safety protocols designed to protect fragile humans were apparently unnecessary. Environmental restrictions were evidently based on incomplete data." As word spread beyond the Academy, the galactic military community began reassessing humanity's role in interstellar defense. Species that had condescendingly offered to protect fragile human colonies suddenly requested detailed information about human military capabilities. The human cadet, oblivious to the institutional chaos their survival had created, finished the tactical manual and requested recommendations for advanced combat theory texts. They had also asked if the cafeteria served anything stronger than coffee, mentioning the day's activities had been mildly stimulating. The Academy's response was to immediately cancel all training exercises pending comprehensive safety protocol review, which seemed like exactly the institutional overreaction that crises they didn't understand typically produced. And so the galaxy's premier military academy found itself needing to protect its alien cadets from training exercises that its human students considered mildly stimulating. The irony was not lost on anyone, particularly the human cadet, who had inadvertently triggered this crisis by walking off fatal injuries like minor inconveniences. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of humor after all.